Okay, good evening. Welcome to the WZB. Welcome to this WZB Distinguished Lecture in the Social Sciences to be delivered by Susan Athey. We initiated this new lecture series 3 years ago, basically to have a platform really to showcase the very best research, relevant research in the social sciences in all the 3 fields. So we have each year 3 of these, one in sociology, one in political science, and one in economics. We started 3 years ago with Thorsten Persson from Stockholm, who talked about the plight of the mediocre man in this day and age. And then in 2013, we had Fabrizio Silibotti of Zurich, who talked about China. And last year, we had El Roth, who talked about repugnant transaction, El Roth from Stanford. Now, today, I'm very happy to welcome Susan Athey, who is also from Stanford. I promise in 2017, we find another university to find a speaker from. Now, I'm here only to welcome you and to introduce the person who's then going to introduce Susan. There's only one intermediary. Okay. Now, one word I have to say about Susan to explain to you the choice of, the intermediary. Susan belongs to a very rare breed of economists. She's an excellent first-class, world-class theorist. But unusually, she also does very serious empirical work, unusually for theorists who work in this level of theory. Now, even more unusually, Susan also talks to people in the real world, and in particular in the tech industry. So, for example, she has been serving as chief economist to Microsoft for a number of years. So when Susan agreed to come to give this lecture, I knew immediately that I wanted to bring back Ludwig Enztaler, who spent some time here at the WZB. Ludwig studied mathematics in Cambridge and economics in Berlin. And after his PhD, he spent some time at UCL in London and then at the WZB in Berlin. But last year, he left us to assume the role of the first chief economist for Rocket Internet, Germany's biggest internet company. So this seemed to be the ideal match and a great opportunity also to get Ludwig back to the WZB. So let me now hand over to Ludwig Enztaler.
Well, thanks so much for this. It's been a great pleasure to spend the last couple of days the free time I had to go over Susan's work. It's an extremely humbling experience because you realize that, Susan's basically touched every field that I'm personally interested in, both in academia and in the real world, at the very highest level. Let me say a few words about Susan's biography. Briefly, she got a PhD from the Stanford Graduate School of Business and then moved on to professorships at MIT, Stanford, and Harvard, to return to Stanford GSB in 2012 to assume the role of the Economics of Technology professor, which she's held since. And as Stefan outlined, Susan has had the appointment of chief economist at Microsoft in the meantime and continues to serve as a consultant to Microsoft, as well as being a board member at various other private sector companies, predominantly in the tech industry. So that's the easy part of the summary of Susan's CV and work, and now the difficult part starts because Susan, as I said, has touched really every subfield of microeconomics that there is and that's interesting out there. This includes game theory, auction theory, mechanism design, industrial organization, decision theory, and beyond the pure narrow realm of microeconomics, also and notably econometrics. And all of this work, as Stefan has said, has always been accompanied not only by publications in the very top field, top journals of the field, but also gone hand in hand with public outreach and teaching, as well as communicating this work to the media, most notably in columns for Forbes magazine, as well as consulting roles in the industry. Now, I had the chance to talk to Susan for 30 minutes this afternoon, and learned a lot, but especially learned that we've had similar experiences when we talk about applying economics to technology, and in particular that there isn't really one big massive field to apply microeconomics to information technology, but that economics pops up in all sorts of different points where it's relevant, and we haven't really got a coherent body of theory yet, but more or less a couple of points where microeconomic theory is extremely relevant. And we discussed a couple of these points, and you really do find them when you go through your work over and over again. And I would like to introduce your work by highlighting three problems, three topics that you've worked on, both in academia, but also communicating them to the real world as well. The first topic I would like to talk, which I think is one of the most important applications of microeconomics in the last couple of years to business, and it's also so extremely appealing theoretically, is the online advertising market and the auctions for online ads. So, as you may or may not know, when you go onto Google or Microsoft Bing or surf the internet, you're bombarded with ads, right? And some of these ads are placed there in the old-fashioned way, that someone pays for this ad to be there all week, all day long, whoever comes to visit the website. But a lot of these ads are highly personalized. So I'd see a different ad than you would see depending on what time of day it is that you surf this website, or what device you use to browse this website, and so on. And these ads are sold in an auction, and these auctions, they run by the split second, they run in the background on some big service, and they're served to you as you enter this page. And there's a lot of IT that goes into this, but there's also an enormous amount of economics that goes into this. So the reason that Google, that Microsoft also, and many other companies are so amazingly successful financially is the reason that they do sell a lot of advertising in these auctions. The economics, the microeconomics of these position auctions is extremely difficult to grasp. It changes continuously, and it changes in particular with the technology. So we need different type of auction formats when we use them on your laptop, whether it is on the mobile phone that you use them, or other technical devices, just to name a few changes that are necessary to the auctioning mechanism driven by technology. And Susan has worked on the problem of online advertising quite a lot, both academically, but also as your role as a consultant to Microsoft in the exciting times when Bing started, as you told me, and a number of publications have resulted from this. So, for example, the position auctions with Consumer Search, which is a QJE paper joined with Glenn Ellison, and the skewed bidding in paper action auctions for online advertising, published in the American Economic Review, joined with Agarwal and Young. You're also very active in teaching this, so I see there are specialized courses on this at Stanford. I wish I'd been able to attend one of them. That would have been extremely helpful. It's extremely difficult to grasp the one big message that comes out of this work, but so I've worked on these problems a lot myself and see them. I think the challenge here is to really find the right model and the right analysis for the circumstances that technology dictates. And that's an ever-changing field. There's a lot of dynamics in there. And finding the right model here is really the challenge. And I think a lot of the work that you do is in response to this. And that's the one big field that I see that you spend a lot of time on, and that's been hugely influential, especially given the size and the scale of the industry, which really is influenced by a couple of players that are the marketplace bottleneck between the advertisers and the consumers. So this really is a product that affects billions of people every day who use these couple of sites, and being able to influence these markets is certainly one of the most, as a microeconomist, I couldn't really think of a product that would influence more people that you can work on, driven through our research and the academic work that we do. So I think it's one of the most fascinating and high impact markets that there are. So that's the first topic, where your work and both your academic work and your consulting work really influences products used by billions of people. The second line of work, and that's very much what you'll be talking about today, I guess, is that I could see a theme that you work on fields where the technology really does impact the market structure of markets, right? So, for example, in the news industry, again, that's today's topic, the impact of targeting technology on advertising markets and media competition. Again, an American Economic Review paper, joint with Joshua Gantz, where you analyze the question: is the declining ad revenue, is that due to different behavior of people? Because it just makes reading news online makes it a lot easier for us to switch our news consumption from one media outlet to another. So there's it's a technology-driven shift in behavior, and does that cause ad revenue for media outlets to decline, and therefore really shift the entire market structure of that market, of that vertical? So again, it's a mix of technology and microeconomics. But in this particular line of research, I think you're a lot more confronted with the industrial organization aspects that are caused by technology and by technological change. And I find that a fascinating line of research. The third category that I'd like to highlight that you've worked on and actively work on is again a topic of influx from the technology companies around you, probably onto economics, and that's the influence of machine learning in econometrics. So you've recently been very active in promoting both in academic research and in teaching to highlight methods that import techniques from machine learning into the social sciences, in particular into economics. And I think there's even a dedicated course to machine learning and causal inference, which is probably the first of its kind out there. I could go on and list different topics that you work on. You've worked on other things. What I find, I could probably list 3 or 4 other themes where you look at the economics that either influences technology or has been influenced by technology. Your work on Bitcoin, for example, where you talk about the economics behind the mathematics-based currency that Bitcoin / blockchain technologies that are, might completely disrupt the banking sector in the years to come, and various other topics. So if I was to span an umbrella, over this body of work, then I would say that it's really about a transfer between what makes your work special, this line of work special, a transfer of economic theory and high-tech and technology, and it's a transfer that really works both ways. So it's taking the machine learning and bringing it to social science, econometrics. It's taking the technology that changes and looking how it changes the market structure. But it also goes in the other way. It's taking what we know about auction theory and bringing it to new markets to sell advertising. So it's a two-way autobahn between, on the highest level, between practitioners' work and, as Stefan has said, economic theory. So I hope this continues. I'll be following your website even closer than I have been in the past, to see what's next, what the next hot things are to work on, how our knowledge of economics, economic theory, econometrics can influence these mass products that are used by billions of people, and how our new technologies give us a new piece of economics or economic analysis. And I'd be extremely keen to listen to your talk about the changes of media consumption. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much. I think that is definitely the best introduction I've ever gotten. I think most people look at my CV and just say, "You are weird." So, so you actually, I think, see a little bit of the coherence in it. So thank you very much. And thanks so much for inviting me here. I've had a wonderful day today, getting to talk about all sorts of different parts of economics that people are working on here. It was really an exciting day. And so actually you got a little bit of background about, maybe that will help you understand how I came to this topic of the internet and the news media. When I started working on Bing and working with Microsoft in 2007, really the reason that they invited me to work with them is that they realized that they needed microeconomics to help them compete with Google and search and generally in online advertising. And that was really the first thing I worked on there based on my previous research in designing markets. But I very quickly got immersed in the whole world of search and big data, and it was really this environment, first of all, that was full of computer scientists and engineers and one economist, and they didn't care how many fancy prizes I had or what university I was from. I needed to make my arguments on first principles. I needed to sort of show why economics and social science methods matter. And so that really led me into this current research agenda of combining machine learning and econometrics and causal inference, because I saw that billions of dollars were at play at Facebook and at Google and at Microsoft, and it was all being run by people who couldn't even define causality or causal inference. And they were making a lot of bad decisions as a result, and still are. There's been, really that first came about in terms of observations and then into the science. And so I'm going to show you very briefly one of the things I've worked on there today that I know there's a lot of experimentalists here, and so it was a method designed for large-scale A/B testing, but also is applicable for small-scale tests. And then the second thing was that really trying to see, when you work on a search engine, you really realize how much internet websites and mobile applications are sort of puppeteers. You realize that you change things and you change people's behavior, hundreds of millions of people's behavior, and that small changes that you make in the user interface, how results are presented, even if your main goal is just to make the user happy, there's a lot of arbitrary decisions along the way, different directions for innovation, and that really changes the information people get. And so that really got me thinking about information and the role of intermediaries in how you get information. And if you think back to the 1990s, the Microsoft antitrust case around Internet Explorer, it was important, and it was certainly, Microsoft used its market power to promote Internet Explorer. But it seems very quaint because back in 1995, really, what difference did it make from the broader economic perspective, what you got through Internet Explorer? Because just a very, very small fraction of the economy went through Internet Explorer. Now, fast forward 20 years, and think about what goes through your mobile phone. Everything goes through your mobile phone. You even the brick and mortar firms, you're finding them with the maps and so on. And so the power of these intermediaries to affect what you do, what shops you choose, what news you read is just enormous. And if you see it firsthand, like I have, you really appreciate that power. And if you switch from an Android to an iPhone, or if you switch from an iPhone to an Android phone, you're going to change which services you use. You're going to change really how you consume in the economy. And then as mobile money and everything else goes onto the phone, that power is going to be even more concentrated. And there's a lot of economics that suggest that we're always going to have concentration. It's going to be a few firms, one firm, two firms. You guys basically have one search engine in Europe. That's what you're stuck with. And the choices they make are going to determine what you do. So that's, I think a really compelling theme to think about how technology is changing our lives and changing industries. I wanted to focus on the news industry in particular because it's just so important. And also because it's something where it's easier to measure in the sense that, I can see news articles, I can see what people are consuming and really measure that better than I can some other parts of the economy. So today I'm going to talk about actually 4 different papers. I'm going to start with a theoretical paper that kind of helped frame the impact of what the internet is doing on advertising markets. And then I'll move into a series of a field experiment and then a series of empirical papers that show direct evidence based on large-scale data sets. So, media, it's under pressure, low advertising revenue. They, in some sense, I talk to the newspapers. I teach at Stanford a class that's popular with our night journalism fellows, which is 20 hand-picked people from across the media industry. They love my class, but they always leave very depressed. And, I try to explain in some sense, the newspapers being very profitable was sort of an accident of history. That is unlikely to return. There were lots of things bundled together into a single delivery mechanism arriving on your doorstep. That's gone and it's sort of not coming back. They said, well, are you basically saying, I use a farmer's market analogy for advertising marketplaces. They said, we used to be the farmer's market and now we're the farmers. Sort of yes, that's kind of, and Google is the farmer's market. And so, the world has changed in sort of fundamental ways for them. And of course, this has lots of implications. We're going to lose good journalism. We've seen international bureaus cut. We've seen reporters cut and so on. So we're going to get less good information. So this is sort of the chart of doom. And this is the U.S. newspaper industry in real dollars. And this sort of shows how as the internet peaked, the newspaper ad revenue kind of fell off a cliff. And it's not due to circulation. It's not due to classifieds. It holds up to that. So first I'm going to talk about a paper with Emilio Calvano, who's in Italy, and Joshua Gans from Toronto, about the impact of consumer multi-homing on advertising markets and media competition. And I'll just put in a little plug for the IO theorists in the audience. Two-sided market theory is so great to work on. It is so important, and we know almost nothing relative to what we need to know. So when I teach, I worked 7 years on Google competition policy on behalf of Microsoft. Almost nothing that I needed to know was written down in a published paper, but yet it's very amenable economics. I understand the economics, but we just haven't written the research papers. So is it going to be a hot topic in Europe for the next 5 to 10 years, and I really encourage people to work in this area. So this will give you a little sense of this paper should have been written before, but these are the kinds of issues that people haven't really addressed. So the theory paper is trying to rationalize 2 facts. First of all, the internet has facilitated consumer switching between outlets, and second, there's imperfect tracking between outlets. So you're going to consume many more media outlets than you used to. You used to, especially in terms of newspapers, you might have consumed 1 in the past. Now you're consuming many. And it's hard for online advertisers to know if you've seen their ads on other websites. There's lots of tracking technology, but it doesn't work very well. Okay. Just to give a sense of that, I'm co-teaching this year with the CEO of ComScore, which does a lot of tracking of consumers online, and they can see the users as they go from website to website. There were some advertisers who were using the best tracking technology available to try to run very large advertising campaigns. And their goal was to hit every consumer between 3 and 8 times. So they were attempting to do that. They viewed 1 to 2 ads as wasted and more than 10 ads as wasted. And there's some empirical work behind that that's of moderate quality. But that was their objective. But when you actually tracked the consumers, like with a device, with software on the PC that really looked at where the consumers went rather than relying on cookies, more than half the ads were what they call wasted. Okay, and that's just to illustrate that it's even with all the cookies following you around, you switch browsers, you switch devices, and you just can't, the advertisers just can't keep track of you. So the traditional media economics, which is itself not very old because two-sided market theory is not very old, like it's after my PhD in 1995, but the Anderson-Coate theory of media economics, the first models we wrote down had consumers single homing. So you were either going to go to the Boston Globe or the Washington Post, and when the consumers segment themselves, choose one newspaper or the other, then the advertisers in response will want to multi-home. That is, if they're a national advertiser, they'll want to go to both the Washington Post and the New York Times in order to get all of those users. Okay? So that's the sort of theory, and essentially what happens is that the newspapers are a monopolist over their users. And indeed, competition policy around newspapers like 20, 30 years ago was all about the monopolies the newspapers had and the monopoly prices they were charging to advertisers. And so the FTC would block mergers because they were monopolizing markets. Okay? And so, but really what they did is they hired a lot of journalists in order to attract users, but once the user was a subscriber, the only way to find that user on a newspaper was to go to the newspaper. And so that leads to what's called a competitive bottleneck. And this is also, not a terrible way to think about search engines. They get their users and then they auction them off to the advertisers, okay? And they can extract, all the surplus, or a lot of the surplus out of the advertisers. So in our model, we said, well, this is not a really good model of what people are doing online, because one of the big changes of what happens online is that you go to lots of outlets. So you're switching. That's what Google News does, and I'm going to show you a lot of evidence about that later. Search engines and everything, they send you to lots of media outlets. And once the consumers multi-home, the question is what will happen to the advertisers? And again, just from a theoretical economics perspective, what's kind of crazy is that we've actually been working on this paper for far too long, but when we started, there was basically no paper that had consumers partly multi-homing. All the models said that you either, by assumption, went to all outlets or you went to only one, but there was nothing in between. And of course, everything that's happening in the internet is what's happening in between. Similarly, the other side of the market would also be assumed to multi-home, like it was like a primitive assumption. Are you single-homing, going to one place, or multi-homing? That was an assumption. This model said, well, what if we assume that the consumers go to both, but not, they might go to both, but they don't definitely go to both? What will be the response of the advertisers? And what will happen to the money? So just to think about this from the perspective of an advertiser, a consumer might go to one outlet in the morning and see an ad. Now, in the afternoon, they might go back to that same outlet and see a different ad, but they might also switch outlets. For the advertiser's perspective, they hope they see a different ad, but they might also see the same ad. Okay? And so it's easier within an outlet for the outlet to keep track if the user's seen an ad, but across outlets, that doesn't work very well. So if Starbucks only goes to one outlet, it might miss somebody. And if it goes to multiple outlets, it might hit the same people twice. And that's essentially what ComScore was finding when they looked at these advertisers. They were either missing people or they were hitting them too many times. So the formal model we have is that we have just this really simple model, 2 outlets, consumers have 2 periods of attention, and they have some probability of switching. In our model, the advertisers want to impress each consumer once, and we have different types of advertisers. It's a continuum of advertisers. Some of them really value hitting consumers, and some of them not so much. So you can think of it as maybe somebody selling credit cards or cars, and then there's other advertisers selling a lower value product. And so we can think about what happens that inside an outlet can avoid impressing the same consumer twice, but you can't do that very well across outlets. And in our model, you can't do it at all. And so that's going to create a gap between the number of ads that an advertiser pays for and the number of unique users the advertiser reaches. So if consumers are switching a lot, they might see fewer unique users per ad. It also depends on the advertiser's choice, because if the advertiser only goes to one outlet, then they're going to get one unique user per ad. But if they go to lots of outlets, they won't get as many unique users for ads. And that's kind of an interesting thing, that like the product is changing in a sense. The thing that the advertiser is trying to buy users, but the product changes depending on their multi-homing behavior. So we look for a very simple equilibrium where there's a single price for advertising, and we find that advertisers segment according to value. So multi-homing advertisers, if you're going to buy on multiple outlets, you need to value the users more than the price, but if you're only getting half a user per ad because you're wasting a lot of them, then your value needs to be high enough that your value per user has to be high enough that half a user is greater than the price. If you're a low value advertiser, that isn't going to make sense for you, so you're going to choose to single home. So what we're going to find is that the high value advertisers multi-home, like the credit card companies plaster all the newspapers with ads, but if you're more of a small value advertiser, you're going to choose only a single outlet. And that's going to reduce the effective demand for advertising and lower advertising prices relative to the case where the users single home. In addition to the kind of expected result that when you lose monopoly power, you also lower prices. So beyond the market power effect is just an effect that comes through this tracking. So we basically find that this advertiser mixed homing, which is exactly what you see in practice, and it's also going to have implications for industry structure. From a platform economics perspective, more multi-homing on one side of the market leads to less multi-homing on the other side of the market. That's the kind of comparative static that people just haven't done very much asking of. But it's really important in lots of platform markets. And as now we get Uber and Airbnb and all sorts of other platform markets, we can think about Uber drivers multi-homing. We can think about consumers multi-homing between Uber and Lyft and other types of apps. And some of these similar types of economics come into play. And so we can also think about then what's going to happen to the industry. Blogs or things that don't have high value advertising actually can be good because they take up attention without taking up a lot of advertising capacity. In our model, it's like a closed system, so we don't assume that more outlets bring more attention, rather that consumers have a fixed amount of attention. Aggregators take up time and they don't show a lot of ads, especially like Google News, but they increase switching. And the more consumers switch, the worse it is for advertising profits. And I'm going to show you later that Google News and things like it have a massive effect on switching. They make you go to many, many more outlets. Then if we think about what kinds of news outlets will survive, well, in this model, being big has a huge advantage. If you're big, you can track your consumers. And it turns out when Facebook sells advertising, they don't go to advertisers and say, we have a great social network. They tried that and gave it up years ago. What Facebook sells is I know who the user is, and I can tell you exactly how many times you're going to impress each consumer. And they compete with TV, and they compete with everything else because they know who you are. You log in every time you use Facebook, and so they know exactly who you are across all your devices. So there's a big return to being Facebook. We should see media mergers and other consolidation in the media industry. It's going to be very hard to survive on your own as a media outlet in this environment. Okay. And I mentioned paywalls. So paywalls are something everybody's still experimenting with. The problem with paywalls is that when you shrink your user base, you get the exact opposite effect. When you're small, you're not valuable to advertisers anymore. If they want to go to just one outlet, they'd rather go to a big outlet. So paywalls, you shrink once because you charged a price, and then you shrink your revenue again because you get a lower price per user. Now, the Wall Street Journal has a premium base, so they can get away with this. But if you don't have a unique audience, the paywall can be really problematic from a monetization perspective. Okay, so now I want to move on to showing you more direct evidence about what intermediaries do. And so I'm going to start with a field experiment that I ran at Bing. This was actually done at the request of the European Commission. The experiment actually would not have been done otherwise because it's actually a very expensive experiment. We run thousands of experiments a year at Google and Bing and Amazon and so on, but almost all those experiments are designed to improve the user experience. This experiment actually hurt the user experience. And so it was really an experiment designed to learn a fundamental fact. And the question the European Commission had was, how much can you manipulate traffic? If you re-rank things, does it matter? And some of the people in the chief economist's office at the time that I did this were really quite skeptical that what's on the web page is actually going to affect your behavior that much. Now, if you ask anybody in Silicon Valley, like all the parents of my kids' kindergarten class know this, but if you're not surrounded by tech firms, you may not know how important position is and the layout of the screen is for what users do. So they said, well, gosh, if it's all on a web page, how much lower could search costs get? We used to think about search costs as like driving to different gas stations. If it's all on a web page, position couldn't possibly matter. Of course, like half the R&D at Google and Bing is about getting the relevance right, so we knew it mattered. But I ran a large-scale randomized experiment on millions of users, actually in the UK and the US. These are US results. And what we did is we took the link on the top position and put it in the 3rd position, or put it in the 5th position, or put it in the 10th position. And then we asked, what happens to what users do? And so here on the graph, in the y-axis is click-through rate, CTR, the probability that the link gets clicked. And so the dark orange boxes are in the control group, where everything is ranked as it should be. What's the probability of a click? So this says that on a typical page, the top position gets 25% probability of clicks, the 3rd position gets 7%, then we go to 4% and 2%, okay? But of course, this is not a causal claim. The dark orange is not a causal claim, because if Bing knows what it's doing, Bing put the best thing in the top position. So we don't know if the thing is getting clicked 25% of the time because it's good or because it's in the top position. To do causal inference, we need to do a randomized controlled experiment, and so that's what we did. So the light orange plus the dark orange is what the click-through rate was of the thing in the top position when it was placed in the 3rd position. So it was ranked in the top position, but placed in the 3rd position. And so we see that the thing in the top position loses about half of its clicks, so the dotted box is what it loses when it moves. And so there we can also decompose the effect of quality versus the effect of position, because the typical thing in the 3rd position gets a 7% click-through rate, but if you put the thing in the 1st position there, it gets a 12% click-through rate. So this light shaded area is sort of the quality effect. It's the part that because the thing in the top position was better. So there's a position effect and a quality effect. The top area is the position effect, and then this is the quality effect. Okay? So this randomized controlled experiment shows that I can take away almost all of your clicks, even if you're a very good website, by putting you at the bottom of the page. And I don't have to move you down very far to take it away. We also did experiments looking at the effect of big boxes and found that those had even more substantial effects. Okay. Now, this is actually a little bit of a sidebar, but there's so many experimental people here that I couldn't resist. I'm going to show you then what you can do to actually understand the heterogeneous treatment effects in this experiment. And so this is a data setting where there are lots and lots of covariates. I'm actually, in my analysis, I use like 100, but there's actually thousands and thousands of things I can observe about a query that comes in. I can classify it. How likely is it movies? How likely is it celebrity? How likely is it informational? I can look at all sorts of things about the user that entered the query. So I know lots and lots of things about each time a user comes in to this website. And so I can start to understand, well, is this position effect, is it uniform across all queries? We might think that it might be much more important for some queries than others. But those of you who do experiments know that there's sort of a prohibition for data mining. Okay, data mining is bad if you do experiments, and data mining means I ran my experiment, I didn't get a significant result for my treatment, so I start fishing around, and maybe there's some subpopulation I did get a significant effect. And there's something called multiple testing in statistics, which says that if you try 100 different things, probably 5% of them are going to come out positive, even if there was no effect. So multiple testing is bad, and experimentalists are supposed to make a pre-analysis plan about how to look for heterogeneity. In fact, people die all over the world every year because that same standard is required for health studies. So if you have a drug and you find out afterwards that the drug is really bad for some people and really good for other people, you can't actually use that because it wasn't part of your pre-analysis plan. So the drug might be great for a subpopulation, but if you didn't predict it in advance, you need to run a new clinical trial. So there's a bunch of examples actually where this occurs. So the method that we develop, and this is a paper with Hito Imbens for doing this, is we imported some methods from machine learning called regression trees. And what regression trees do is they create a partition of your data set, or a tree, a hierarchical partition, according to covariance. And so what we did is we modified that method, which was designed for prediction, and solved a bunch of technical issues to make it good for causal inference, not prediction. So we can apply it to a randomized experiment, and instead of just predicting an outcome, we're going to predict a causal effect. And we're going to use a technique called sample splitting to get valid standard errors with no multiple testing problems. And so what we get out of this is a tree that says, okay, here's a subpopulation. It's about 1.2% of the population where there's no effect of re-ranking the results. And these are ones that were classified as good for image and likely to be about celebrities. So in some sense, if you're searching for a celebrity, you're not going to click on any of the informational links. You're probably going to click on the picture. And so the ranking doesn't really make a big difference. On the other hand, here's one where you lose 20% of your clicks, and the average was 13. So this is a big effect. And this was one that was classified to be likely to be a Wikipedia reference, and it had a bigger treatment effect. Okay, so you get a tree like this. And this is a couple 100,000 observations, and you come up with all of these subgroups, and for each of the subgroups, I've got a valid treatment effect and confidence interval. And then one of the great things about it is the method has actually found the subgroups where the treatment effect heterogeneity is the biggest. That's what it's doing. It's searching over all the possible, not all the possible subgroups, it's got a greedy algorithm, because that would take a zillion years. But it finds a smart way to find treatment effect heterogeneity and which subgroup. So this is actually getting put into practice on several major tech firms' A/B testing platforms, so the experimentation platforms that they use, so that they can also, in an automated way, find the heterogeneous treatment effects. And remember, everything that changes at Google or Bing goes through a randomized controlled experiment. But I also think this is going to be useful for field experiments and possibly lab experiments if you actually know something about your individuals. Okay? And this slide is just showing part of what we do to get valid standard errors is that we split the sample. We use half the data to kind of find the subgroups and the other half to do the estimates. And even with a couple 100,000 observations and only 20-odd subgroups, we actually find a lot of bias. That is, if you don't do the sample splitting, if you ask an algorithm to find subgroups that have things together, they're going to find spurious stuff. Even with this is like a regression with 20 dummy variables in it and a couple 100,000 observations, but even with that type of data set, bias can be important. Okay, so now you hopefully believe that aggregators and intermediaries have a big impact on what you do. It can change what you read. Now I'm going to show you how that works in the news industry. And we're going to focus on two aspects of the changing online media landscape. The first is news aggregators, which has been especially big in Europe. So both of my studies are going to be using European data, and then social media. So the news aggregators, first of all, as many of you know, has been a big policy issue. So this is one of the most fun conferences I've been to. We had a workshop at the FTC, and I had Arianna Huffington and Rupert Murdoch, and I also got to speak, so that was kind of fun. Actually, the best part was when Arianna Huffington quotes Rupert Murdoch. So in her speech, she went through all of his previous speeches, and this is Rupert Murdoch in Arianna Huffington's words. The Huffington Post and Google News are parasites, content kleptomaniacs, vampires, and tech tapeworms in the intestines of the internet. Okay, that's my favorite one because that's actually got good economics in it. Rupert Murdoch is a very good economist. He understood two-sided markets well before Jean Tirole, and he really nailed it. He's very, very good at this. So, but he, what the tech tapeworms on the intestines of the internet is that this is something that doesn't go and forage for the food. Like, they don't go and do the reporting, and they wouldn't survive without somebody else foraging for the food, but they make money off of it. So that's the criticism. On the other hand, you know, the other side of it is that actually aggregators and search engines, and they help people find stuff. They're like taxis. They drive traffic to the newspaper. And maybe a slightly deeper thing is that they lower the cost of news discovery and help niche publishers. Okay? And so it's really actually, from a regulatory perspective, this issue comes up over and over again with all the new tech platforms. A new platform comes in with a new business model, and you don't even know what market it's in. You know, like, is Google News a newspaper? It sure looks like a newspaper. It looks, you know, just like the New York Times, only better because it's got all the content from the whole internet, including the New York Times, right? So it from a consumer perspective, it looks like a newspaper. But on the other hand, it's also a search engine. I mean, it's helping you find stuff. And that is a sort of a different object. And so what we're going to try to do is quantify how much is it a competitor to the newspapers and how much is it a complement to the newspapers. And so, you know, the substitute, the readers can read the headlines and snippets without clicking on articles, and indeed about half the visitors to Google News don't click through. So if you go there and you don't click through, clearly it can't be a complement, it's got to be a substitute. On the other hand, they're going to reduce search costs and therefore make it easier to find outlets. How many URLs do you know? But there might be some outlet out there that has a great story on the topic you're interested in, and how are you ever going to find it without an aggregator? It's going to have a differential impact on small and large publishers, which is going to affect the industrial organization of the industry. Small publishers might benefit relatively more than larger publishers from aggregators. Large publishers can attract viewers through their brand. It's also going to have a differential impact on landing pages, that is like the home pages, the front pages, and articles. Because Google News doesn't send you to the front page, it sends you to an article. All the valuable advertising is on the front page, not on the article page. So they're going to sort of bypass the door. And in addition, you know, what is the front page? That is what the editors do, right? They choose what's important for you to read. And if you don't go there, you're going to read what the algorithms designed by the engineers in Mountain View want you to read. And that's a different thing. It might be better because they are more attuned to user popularity, and they can respond faster. It might be worse because they're not actually telling you about, if something's not popular, it's not going to show up on Google News, and they're not going to be able to sort of inform you about what's happening in Syria or other types of events. And then, you know, that we also can think about a new competitor in this space. Facebook in the last year has started doing instant articles and asking the newspapers to deliver their content to the users through Facebook. Farmers market versus farmers, well, now Facebook is the farmers market and the news articles are the farmers. They might lose their differentiation, and Facebook then curates your news rather than Google. Okay, so the first thing we're going to show you is the results for a natural experiment as a result of legislative action in Spain. So the Spanish Parliament passed a law in 2014 that would require news aggregators to pay for news snippets in news.google.es and similar sites. It didn't aim at Facebook and Twitter. This is not so crazy because, like, Microsoft, MSN, Yahoo News, they actually pay the newspapers that they have partnerships with. But Google News didn't pay anybody. They did not like the idea of paying anybody, so they shut down. And actually, Yahoo and Big News also shut down, and partly they just weren't set up to do this, and so when the law passed, everybody just shut down. We used this shutdown as a natural experiment to analyze how Google News users reacted to the shutdown. And to understand why it's so important to get a natural experiment like this, you know, if you think about taking one newspaper out of Google News, it doesn't really affect anything because some other newspaper also has similar content. And so, one newspaper at the time, you can't really learn what the aggregate effect of Google News is overall. But taking away Google News entirely allows us to really understand that better. So we're going to understand, did Google News users read less news? That is, was Google News a complement to their news reading? Which outlets benefited? How did landing page and article consumption change? And then I'll show you some work, what we've been working on most recently is what kinds of topics did people read? So we're going to have data from internet browsing, 160,000 PC internet users in Spain who viewed at least one news website per week. We're going to look at 175 Spanish news outlets that comprise 95% of news browsing. And we're going to use a difference in difference approach. We're going to use use the user pre-period to establish user patterns. So this is the chart of overall news viewing in Spain, and this bar is the shutdown. Now, interestingly, right after the shutdown in the popular media, people reported that, oh my gosh, after Google News shut down, news viewing is falling off a cliff. But if you'll notice, this right here is Christmas. Okay? And this is one of the huge challenges of doing observational studies online. First of all, there's these crazy day of week effects, so you have to control for that. And then there's a lot of cyclicality and seasonality. And if there's a snow day or something, it's going to affect what people do. And so you really need to get a baseline for what's going on. Then you also get these crazy spikes. So Princess Christina indicted on corruption charges, and boom, everybody goes to read the news. So what we can see is that if we want to really understand this phenomenon, we're going to need to think hard about controlling for time trends. Then the second problem is that actually, the idea that Google News had caused a 25% reduction in news was just crazy, because actually Google News homepage is a tiny share of news consumption in Spain. So this is news consumption by referral source. And so we say that Google News referred you to an article if the session that you have started with Google News. So if you go to Google News and they take you to the New York Times, and then you read 3 news articles on the New York Times, we'll say all of those were referred by Google News. And so Google News is actually very, very small. Now, Google search is quite big, but a lot of the metrics people look at may not even distinguish. They just know it comes from Google. They don't realize how small Google News was. So Google News really can't have had a big aggregate impact on Spain. So in light of that, why am I even showing you this if this is all so hopeless? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to study those people who used Google News a lot and do a difference in difference analysis where we're going to compare the heavy Google News users to very similar non-Google News users and then see what happened to the consumption of the Google News users. Realizing that they are not typical users, we're going to match them with other users who read the same amount of news. And actually, in some of the stuff now, we're controlling for that read the same topics of news. So you both liked Ebola, then you're going to be matched with each other. So this is a technique, actually, that we also have used a lot in my work with Microsoft and other tech firms, this idea that there's some sort of natural experiment, and you create a synthetic control group for the treated users. So for whatever reason, some set of advertisers or some set of sellers or some set of users experience the treatment, and then we have all these other users, and so we look out in many dimensions to find users that are very similar and use them as a control group. So this is what it looks like just in terms of a picture. My treatment users, who are heavy Google News users, is the red line. The control users, as you can see, match them very closely before the shutdown, and then after the shutdown, the heavy Google News users stop reading as much news. And so the simple difference in difference is that these Google News users decrease their news reading by about 16 to 17%. Okay? So that's saying that in the aggregate statistics, Google News helps people read more news. Okay, that's the first finding. And I'm generally kind of anti-Google, so I always like to say, okay, this is my pro-Google slide. This is saying that Google helps you find stuff. It's really true what they're claiming. And so we can look at there's a lot of numbers on here. We're going to break things out by referral source. So this is how the reader found the news, and then this is the type of place that they read: all news, articles only, landing pages, like the landing page of the sports section, the landing page of the politics section. These are the front pages where the curation occurs. And then other content, which is like slideshows and things like that. And so what we're going to see overall, just looking at the percentage numbers, is that when Google News goes away, my difference in difference estimate, that is how much my treatment group minus control group varies from before to after, that estimate is going to be minus about 16%. Now we see for articles, it's minus 17.5%, and for landing pages, it's minus 20%. So when Google News goes away, it actually is going to hurt your consumption of all of these different kinds of news. Okay? Now over here, we see a positive result for other content, and there you can sort of think about slideshows. Like if you go directly to a newspaper, they're going to try to push you towards the slideshows because they want to get a lot of pages and sell a lot of ads as you flip through the slideshow. That's going to happen less when you have Google News around. Okay? So this is the basic finding, and this comes out of a regression where we actually have daily fixed effects. So it's not just a simple comparison of means, and it's also robust to interacting the time trend with all the user characteristics. Okay. So then we can say, well, let's try to look at a different way. What are kind of the substitutes for Google News, just in terms of shares? So we have an aggregate effect, but then we want to say within the user's consumption, how does the share of their consumption change? And so we see for the Google News users that they're going to substitute towards direct navigation is going to be the biggest thing they substitute towards. And then they substitute towards search. Okay. Now the thing that starts to get more interesting is to break this out by the outlet size. And here we're actually going to get very different results for big outlets and small outlets. So in particular, we're going to see that when Google News goes away, the Google News users go more to top outlets. Okay? So that is, the top 5 outlets are actually competitors of Google News. And when you take Google News away, people go to them more. Now when you break that out, it's actually coming from the landing pages mostly, also other content, but there's not much other content. So the effect is really driven by the landing pages. That is, when you take Google News away, you go to the home page of a big outlet. You actually go, overall, you read less articles, and that's because you read less news. So you read less news, you're gonna not go to all those articles that were referred by Google News, but the landing pages benefit. Now it's kind of in the middle, it's kind of a mixed bag. When I go down to the very small outlets, then they're gonna lose a lot of news reading as a result of taking Google News away. So Google News is a complement for the small outlets. It helps them get found. Because how many people bookmark a very small outlet? The only way they're getting traffic is to get referred from other folks. Even for them, though, even for the very bottom, taking Google News away does increase their landing page viewership. Okay? But they lose articles. Okay. So then we can also look at the share of news reading by outlet size. And as you move, when you lose Google News, you can see it here, you're going to substitute mostly to top 5 and then less to the bottom outlets. Okay? So that's really saying that Google News does both. It's a search engine, but it's also a direct competitor. And so the very top outlets, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, no wonder they're out there, and Springer and so on, no wonder they're out there going to the European Commission and saying, hey, kill Google News, because it's their direct competitor. They'd be better off without it. So, and then I just want to say a brief word about welfare. So generally, we don't know if it's good or bad that you read more small outlets. So some small outlets don't do a lot of R&D, research and development. They just copy stuff, okay? And so in some sense, sending traffic to people who copy stuff is bad from an innovation and research and development perspective, because they're not, why do we want people to get viewers? We want the viewers to bring the advertising revenue. The advertising revenue rewards the investment in the reporters. So you want people to appropriate the returns to their investment. So if we send people to small outlets for copying, Google News is bad for R&D. But if the small outlets provide diverse viewpoints, it might be good for informativeness and also for matching for consumer taste. So this is really ambiguous. It would take a lot more data work to sort those two things out. Maybe I'll do it. I'm not sure. Okay. Then in terms of number of distinct outlets, I mentioned earlier I was going to show you what happens to how loyal you are to outlets. We see that when Google News goes away, there's a very substantial reduction in the number of distinct outlets that you visit, which is especially large for the smaller outlets. You go to 40% less distinct small outlets. Okay, so now that's sort of like the market structure issue, small versus large. Now let's think about actually what information you consume. What do you learn about? Do you learn about Princess Christina? Do you learn about Ebola? Do you learn about Syria? What are you going to learn about? And so there's really kind of, we know that Google News makes people read more. What we want to now understand, do they read more about a lot of different things, or do they go more in depth on the same number of things? And so we also want to, along the way, think about what actually does Google News do differently. And one thing that they do is they identify popular topics faster. So the newspaper, if a new topic becomes popular, they have to go send a reporter. But if one outlet out of 20 has wrote a story about it the day before, Google News can put that to the top immediately. So they're going to be sort of more responsive to things that were unpredictably popular. So first of all, we compare the topics by whether what that people read compared when you went directly to the newspapers, direct navigation, versus if you were referred by Google News. And we do see some differences. So like Ebola was more popular from Google News. Spain government was number 2 for both. And history of Catalan politics was higher for the Google News readers, and so on. And so one of the things that may be harder to absorb quickly from this table, but I can show you better in a picture, it turns out that Google News readers are actually more concentrated in topics rather than less. So if you take the top topic, it's a higher share of Google News readers reading than the top topic for direct, and all the way through the distribution. So that's saying that people are reading more. They're doing more research on a smaller number of topics through Google News. Google News makes you deep. And that kind of makes sense because each a publication is only going to have 1 article per topic. If Google News lets you read the 3 best articles on a topic, and maybe you want to keep reading because they don't all give all the information. Okay. So we look at this a different way. For each user, we compute their Herfindahl across outlets within a topic. So what share of your reading on the Euro crisis is in the first outlet squared plus the second outlet squared plus the third outlet squared? So a concentration index for outlets within a topic. And so we find that the Google News are much less concentrated within a topic, which again is showing that Google News is helping you go more in depth and read a lot more different outlets on the same subject. So Google News is sort of good for in-depth research. And that's also true, surprisingly, relative to search. Even if you come through search, you tend to go kind of to one outlet. Google News is where you go when you really want to do a lot of research. Okay. So that's the summary for Spain, and this is the one we've done the most in-depth analysis of. Now I'm going to show you briefly another natural experiment in France, which is going to give similar results. This one was actually occurred in late 2009 when France introduced local content, and it basically allowed you to opt in to location. So this is cleaner in some ways and less clean in other ways as an observational study than Spain. Spain, they took it away, so it was gone. So that's very clean, but everybody was on the same date. So I can't really get time trends. Like if there's something about what happened in Christmas that was special to Google News users, it's a little harder to control for that. If my control group is wrong, it's going to be wrong across the board. Google Local, you had to opt in on different dates. So every single user has a different treatment date. And so I'm going to construct a synthetic control group of people who were similar to you on the same dates. So if I make a mistake, it's not going to be sort of systematic across all my Google News users. The big problem with this is that these users opted in. And so this is something that you worry about called activity bias on the internet, which is that if you decided on this particular date you wanted to read more local, well, that might mean that you're interested in local. So we do everything we can to control for that, but can't perfectly deal with that problem. And the way we control for it, again, is we are going to match users. We're going to create a synthetic control group over all the users in France who had the same amount of local reading the day before, the hour before, the week before. So we're going to find users who looked exactly like you up to that moment. But nonetheless, there was something special about the moment that you put in this date to Google News. So after you put in that you lived in Paris, you would see local news. And of course, now this is done automatically by Google News. But this was one of the last introductions of local content that I was able to capture when I started studying this. So now we're going to have not a specific date, but the day relative to sign up, because every treatment user and their associated control users have a different calendar date that's date 0. But I can line them all up and show that I do a pretty good job matching the treatment and control users, and I have more control users to reduce the standard errors, so that's why it's less variable. And so before the sign up, they all look very similar. Then on the sign up day, which we omit from our regressions, there's of course a spike for the treatment users, and then we look at what happens afterwards. And so what we see is that there is indeed an increase in news consumption when the local content comes on. And so this, in some sense, also helps you think about, like, what if all the newspapers colluded? So one of the reasons they had that conference at the FTC with Rupert Murdoch was that the newspapers were asking the FTC to give them antitrust competition policy exemptions so they could collude to charge prices to Google News. So this sort of tells you, what would happen if all the local newspapers could collude and say, you can't have our content collectively, okay? And so we see that if they took that away, reversing this experiment, that would hurt Google News. And indeed, we're gonna find that having a whole bunch of local content is really good for Google News. So here are difference estimates, and I'll just focus on these numbers in red. We see that when you add Google News Local, you get increases in not just articles, but also landing pages of local news websites. And interestingly, you also see some increases, much more muted, for non-local news. And that's coming, there's two effects. One is the local takes up screen space and actually takes articles away from non-local, so they lose share. But because that local content made the page so much better, people came more to Google News. Google News was a better product, and so the kind of income effect of having more users dominates the substitution effect, that you lose screen space for non-local to local. And so actually the non-local weren't really hurt by this change, and they were sort of lifted by it. So overall, it's kind of consistent with our results from Spain, which is that Google News is a complement for news reading. Local is kind of by definition small, and so they're the ones that were helped in Spain, and they're also helped in France. You don't go to that many local websites, and Google News makes you go there more because they made them easier to find. And we also have similar results, more dispersed browsing patterns, and so on. Okay. So that's aggregators. Now, in some sense, aggregators are sort of yesterday's news, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about social media, which is kind of tomorrow's news, as it becomes a bigger and bigger part of news consumption. And when I started working on this, by the way, in 2010, it was still very small, so we could barely pick it up. But luckily, I was slow with my research, and now we can pick it up better. And by the way, all of these projects are like incredibly time-consuming. The cleaning of this internet data is just very, very hard. Okay, so social media is important. It's growing in importance, and it's in 2015, Facebook replaced Google News as the top referrer for certain news outlets. So we want to ask similar kinds of questions. We're going to focus more in this paper on the kinds of news people are reading, which is going to be even more affected by social media because you have this social sharing component that really makes people read different things. So we want to know, is news going to be less neutral? Is there going to be more political polarization? Are they going to read different kinds of news, and so on? So we use similar kinds of internet browsing data, this time from the US, but now we really want to know the type of news people are reading. And this we're going to have to work really quite hard for. It's pretty easy to go out and get the news articles and construct simple features. How many quotes? How difficult is the text? Like, is it 8th grade level, 6th grade level? The word count, the sentence length, and so on. But many aspects of the news cannot be accurately constructed with this approach. And so we use actually a fairly novel method to do this. What we do is we use crowdsourcing. Okay, that's not that uncommon, but the problem is, I have hundreds of thousands of articles in my data set, so I can't afford to have humans code all of them. And I actually want to ask them like 50 different things. So that's, even on Mechanical Turk, that's too expensive. So what I do is I classify the articles into topics using text mining, and then I crowdsource the topic characteristics. And it turns out that like most news browsing in a particular week is about 175 different topics. So that's very manageable. And then for certain topics, I'm going to go and crowdsource more articles. So for example, I'm interested in politics, political bias, but only 10% of articles are even relevant for politics. Most people are reading about sports or a storm, the snow, a tornado, a murder. They're not about politics. And so if I can narrow down to the topics that are about politics, then I can spend more money only finding those ones and whether they're politically biased. Okay? So this sort of two-step method was, I think, original for us. So it's a little complicated. I know there's some political scientists probably in the audience, so I'll say a few words about how we construct the topics, because it's really fun working with text. Like, this is a great moment for social sciences, where all the social sciences can work with these data sources and look at text and on a large scale understand what people are saying and doing and reading. So we use a method to classify the topics that's actually multifold. So it's all based on Wikipedia data, but in different ways. So first of all, we get all the concepts on Wikipedia, and it's essentially about a third of news topics actually have a Wikipedia article. So we have a fancy way of figuring that out, but more or less, like, Catalan politics, there's a big Wikipedia article about Catalan politics. Princess Christina corruption, there's a big Wikipedia article about that. Turns out, almost anything important that happens, somebody writes a Wikipedia article. And that's great, because that can be sort of a ground truth for figuring out, what's a topic. And so these are some examples of topics. This is we're still working with our pilot data. We've done we're not quite finished with a longer time sample. So like the Boston Marathon bombings, there's some sports events, the death of Lee Rigby. These are all some of the topics that were very popular, and that most of these we could map directly to Wikipedia. But then that's only about a third of articles, so now we want to get to the next third of articles. And what we do there is we use a method from computer science that's called a network community detection. So we take every article and we construct its links to every other article based on the words that they have in common. And we focus on words that Wikipedia said were important, in particular bigrams, pairs of words that were important from a Wikipedia perspective. And so this gives us a network, and it turns out that this is a better way to classify news, at least as far as we can find, than thinking of just a sort of a rectangular data set approach where you're just trying to predict using kind of one set of features at a time. Because we can really see the patterns of all of these articles having words in common, but they may not all have the same words in common, but we can see the pattern that they're all linked together. And so there's a community detection algorithm which tries to find communities which have a lot of links inside a community and not very many links outside the community. And those work at large scale. And with that, we're able to classify another third of articles, and actually it's incredibly good. Like, we really nail, like there's a few errors, but really the classification just makes a lot of sense. And so this is an example. There was, for some reason, somebody pulled out a picture of President Obama's prom night, the fancy dance at the end of high school, and a whole bunch of people ran stories about it. And so, we were able to discover that just by finding a lot of articles that had fun, happy, sipped champagne, and prom night. And we discovered that we did sort of like finding cats on YouTube. We found President Obama's prom night in the text, okay, without knowing that existed as a concept beforehand. That's called unsupervised machine learning. Well, my decision trees were called supervised machine learning, where you have an outcome you're trying to predict. Unsupervised machine learning means that you just have a bunch of data and you try to find things that are similar. Then we do crowdsourcing by Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, and then we take a bunch of articles, we sample articles within each topic, and then have the Turk workers read the articles all in the same topic. So then we can see, what do we get out of all of this? And this is, very descriptive, and I hope we're going to continue to work on this and find out even more. So what we want to do is compare the share of reading through direct navigation, when you go directly to a news site, versus when you come through social media. And it doesn't all add up. There's more stuff besides direct navigation and social media, but we're not going to show them in the pictures. And then we do this thing, these green bars are going to help control for user mix. So they're going to tell you what direct navigation would have been, what the red bar would have been, if they had the same user mix that you had on social media. Okay? And that's important because suppose we say, oh gosh, people read more about crime and social media than direct navigation. Should the newspaper go out and hire more crime reporters? Well, maybe yes, if you think that that everybody's going to adopt social media and read more crime, but maybe no if you think that what's going to happen is old people are going to move off of their newspaper and onto social media, and the old people are less interested in crime. So you need to know whether it's the user mix or what you actually do once you get there. So in this picture, we actually see some differences, crime, politics, and so on, but a lot of that is accounted for by user mix. So at a very high level, you're reading pretty similar things from Facebook and direct navigation. But where we get a lot more action is when we look within a topic. So here we're going to do counterfactuals controlling for the topic mix, and then we're going to say how do you read different articles on the same topic, like the topic like a sports event or a tornado is a topic. So what we find here is that we do see a lot of differences. For example, social media has a lot more articles with an individual perspective. It's how a person felt when the storm was coming, not just the facts about the storm. More in-depth articles. We also see more in-depth analysis, more controversial or one-sided articles, more socially controversial articles, more opinion articles, politically controversial, and as well, more caring and supportive stories. So you want to share on Facebook an article that shows how much you care about people in a storm, not the facts, because you figure that people already know the facts if they care about the facts. We also see differences in terms of targeting. There's more articles that are sort of interesting to a specific group. Like you might share an article about your favorite sports team to your friends who also like the sports team. If you're a parent, you might share a parenting article, and so on. So we particularly see targeted at parents of young children and targeted at women being shared more on Facebook. There's some results about emotions, more positive articles, compassionate articles as well. So in summary, there's not much variation across the super topics, the big topics, but there's a lot of within topic variation between direct navigation and social media. The final thing we look at is political bias. So first of all, one thing that I didn't really appreciate before doing this work is that different outlets, first of all, cover potentially biased topics at very different rates. So some outlets are much more likely to cover topics that are politically controversial. And second, a lot of the variation in political bias is actually determined by topic, okay? So it's not the case that Fox News, the conservative news in the US, publishes more conservative articles about the 2012 Benghazi attack, which they kind of blame on Hillary Clinton. It's that they have lots and lots and lots and lots of articles about the Benghazi attack. Like according to Fox News, the Benghazi attack is the most important thing that happened yesterday. They're surely going to have an article, and actually if you talk to the people at Fox News, that's part of their branding. We are the go-to source for the Benghazi attack. We will always have something on the Benghazi attack, okay, which was clearly caused by Hillary Clinton. So that actually, if you run a regression for bias, actually you can make the Fox dummy go away if you just control for what topics they cover. And so that's really interesting for thinking about the informativeness of our population, because maybe part of the polarization is just that you're going to think that certain things are important which might not be important. Or, and of course the same thing on the right wing, you're going to have, on the liberal side, you're going to see school shootings, gun, every time somebody gets shot in a school, there's going to be big articles in the liberal outlets. And that's the most important thing that happened, okay? So they're really going to be different in that perspective. So then we look just at potentially politically biased topics, and we try to see, is social media browsing more politically biased? only looking at the topics that are potentially politically biased. If you include all topics, it's all noise because most things are not political. So unlike Matt Jenskow's work, who I love and we just recruited to Stanford, but unlike some of the previous work on this, we actually look at the article level. And so we're really going to control for things, he finds that people who read a lot of news go to Fox and the New York Times. But it turns out a lot of what they're doing is reading about sports and tornadoes. I'm liberal, but I go to Fox all the time for, storms and things because they're the highest ranked on Google News. But, they might have the best local weather reporting or something. So people go, but not necessarily for politics. So we see here that social media has less neutral news and more polarized news. But where we really see an effect is if we look at people who read at least one conservative article the week before. And then for those people who have signaled they're conservative by reading a conservative article, they read almost no liberal news, and they read a lot of biased stuff on social media. So direct navigation is going to give you a more balanced perspective than what you read through social media. Now, these results are actually probably overstated because we have only 2.5 weeks of data here, and so there's a lot of zeros in this data. People who had read one article and then read one other article. So we've expanded it to 6 months, but the results we haven't finished the crowdsourcing yet for that, so I can't show you. So undoubtedly these results will shrink a little bit, but qualitatively, that's what we're finding. And so same for liberals. If you read a liberal news article in the previous week, then we're going to find that you're going to have almost no conservative reading, some neutral reading, and a lot of left-leaning political news. So just to summarize, we find social media is more biased than direct navigation, sort of despite what previous authors have found, and the thing is that we really see the article level, which is why we can find these more nuanced things. Outlets vary a lot in their audience as well as their coverage of topics. And so there is some evidence in favor of what's called the filter bubble, which is that social media just shows you more of things like you. And more broadly, we think, there's a lot of differences due to user mix, but the type of article changes. And all the news media that I talk to, their reporters are onto that. They know, zillions of reporters have emailed me to get this study because they want to write articles that are going to get shared on social media. And so the supply is changing in real time in response to the demand. So I can't study the supply very clearly because I don't have a natural experiment. But I think the implications for the supply of news are really what's interesting here. It's not just how consumers respond to what's there, but the fact that we're not going to get that other stuff, which may be good and may be bad, but it's going to be different. That we know. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
For everybody to ask questions. We will sit here, Susan, maybe you in the middle. So how worried are you about the polarization? I mean, first of all, thanks for the fascinating talk. I mean, that covered so many things. But I mean, the last note you ended on somehow, does it make you worried?
It does. So I want to be a little cautious until I kind of see my final results, but I think it's very intuitive, and it's also consistent with a lot of people who have data in the industry see that people are really getting confused about what's important. And if you think about phenomenon like the rise of Donald Trump and so on, there's a lot of people who really think that a certain small set of topics is the most important thing that's happening. It's the only thing that governments do is blow up your own embassy, in Benghazi. So people get very confused, and then they feel confirmed in those views. I saw another article recently that they were asking politicians about the questions they get from their constituents, and they said there's a huge rise in questions that are just completely factually incorrect. So they said, well, we used to be, we'd get like 5 to 10% of questions where people were just totally misinformed, and now you get like half of your questions are really not based in reality. And of course, the politicians also respond to that in their supply.
Is that even in California? Or?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And so, so then they realize they can, if they say something outrageous, that a certain set of kind of fringe media outlets will pick it up and give it the air of authenticity. And then people will be left thinking, well, maybe that's true. They may not be sure it's true, but they at least think it's plausibly true, which gives people a much wider range to misrepresent facts. And of course, it's possible on the left and the right. In the United States, we're all very concerned about not all, but some of us are concerned about Donald Trump right now, which seems to be a real manifestation of this phenomenon.
Talk. Should I switch this on? Yeah. So maybe related to Stefan's question, on your topics there was a lot of death. So there were, many of the topics were, Boston Marathon, and then the Benghazi events, Margaret Thatcher, many killings. So I wondered whether, so one criticism of that might be maybe your selection of topics is slightly biased towards certain events. But then I thought, well, it's maybe a bigger question than that, which is the importance of Google News and other services may tilt our attention or may bias our attention towards very identifiable events, relative to things like party politics or slower processes of that are maybe of equal importance than an individual killing. So I wonder whether that has been research, or whether you worry about this also with respect to the focus that the media put on certain events.
Sure, excellent questions. So let me start with the easy one. So you asked if we were somehow focused on particular topics. So I probably went by it very fast, but we cover in total about 80% of news browsing. So our classification method covers everything, basically. And then when we manually inspect the things that aren't classified, they're often, a local event, like a particular soldier returned home from Iraq or something. They're very one-off events where there really aren't other related topics. So I haven't quite figured out how to report statistics on that, like the fact that these are niche topics, but for manual inspection, we pretty much cover all the major topics. So that's not, I just showed you the top ones, but there's the 175 or so cover everything. Then the second question of what Google News and I think Facebook do, and we're trying to document this better. We've trying a couple of different ways to quantify it, but I think what's happening is that it's very responsive to popularity. So again, it's very hard for a single newspaper to produce content fast. But Google News can just find if the first person who gets it, it's right up there on Google News. And then Google News has all this data, both from search and from Google News. And so it very quickly figures out what's important, and it in real time re-optimizes its web page. And it's also very good at online experimentation. Even like Microsoft MSN also does this online experimentation. It'll randomize the articles and then promote the successful ones very, very quickly. They'll do, it's like a multi-armed bandit type of thing, where as soon as something starts losing, it gets shown less. So as a result of that, that's good if you think, oh, the traditional media, they're not flexible, they're slow, and as soon as this research is created, everybody should have access to it. That's good. It might be bad, though, if you think about kind of self-reinforcing things, like something gets a little bit popular and then it gains in popularity, and it might crowd out a longer-term topic. So we did try to measure the long-termness of a topic, and we find some evidence about that, but we're still working on that. So we want to sort of think about the life cycle of a topic. Some things kind of spike, and some things have a longer life cycle. And I think that's an interesting, it's not completely easy to summarize that. We have to kind of make up our measures, and we're still playing with that, but I think it's interesting. I think one thing, though, that we have, I think, pretty well nailed down is that, say, Google News really helps you do more research, that you go deeper into a topic on Google News. Probably less so on Facebook.
Thanks again for a fascinating talk. I have two questions. Number one is related to your Spanish experiment. Did you go back, say, half a year later and also looked at the data? Is there a difference in that in terms of, people, long-term user trends? And then, another question, do you look at how the actual consumption of article, and I gather that's hard to measure, of course, of news articles is changing, i.e. how far do users read? Do they read further with social media? Do they read longer? And, it's hard to qualify that. If I go read an article on the New York Review, I might be very well informed, but I've just read one article, so. Yeah.
Absolutely. Excellent questions, too. So I hit all of those slides, but all of our results on page views are pretty much identical when we count dwell time. And so in the internet industry, one of the ways that you count engagement is just how long do you stay on the page. And so there's a little bit of a feature that the Google News users spend a little bit less time per page. And they're sort of, you might, on Google News, if you want to read about a topic, you're going to look at an article, and if it looks like it's not a well-written article, you're just going to go back to Google News and then find another article that might be better. So you get a little bit more shopping for articles on Google News, which is partly why you see more articles per topic. But overall, the aggregate dwell time results are basically the same as what I showed you. So the engagement, in some sense, doesn't undermine that. And that's also, by the way, we also looked at dwell time for the search field experiment where we re-randomize things. So the same kind of qualitative percentages hold for how much, not just clicks, but how much time did you spend on the page, or was this a click where you actually stayed on the page? And those engagement adjusted metrics also work. You asked about Spain and looking back at it later. Sadly, it is hard to track users on the internet longer than about 3 months. You kind of lose track of who they are. And so the quality of your results kind of falls off over time. So from a research perspective, that's difficult using observational data. Data sets like ComScore, where they have a panel of users over a long period of time are great, but they only have, they have a fraction of the users in Spain that I had in this data. The other thing is that it's also just, these users, after 6 months, like lots of things can change. So this is something we were talking about in my office, that even the very best firms who study things, very carefully, like Facebook and Google and so on, have a very hard time measuring long-term effects. So this is another thing that's sort of behind all this research is that I saw firsthand that all the tech firms look at short-term metrics because those are easy to measure. So I can do a one-day experiment and figure out really fast whether I've made the users happy. I am really bad at measuring whether I made my advertisers happy, who are the ones paying for my ads and funding my website. If I'm Amazon or eBay, it's much harder to tell if I've made my sellers happy than if I've made my users happy. Because in one day, you can see if you made your users happy, at least in the short term. You can see if they clicked. But it's very hard to see that 3 months later, the seller throws up his hands and says, I'm not selling on eBay anymore. Those long-term things are hard to measure. So, and even on the user side, I was saying when Bing introduced a new user interface, at that time Google had only 10 blue links. Bing introduced a more complex screen, which later Google actually mimicked. It took actually 3 weeks in the experiment for the users to get used to that new user interface. And for an ordinary experiment, they would have just shut it off and said, oh, users don't like it, forget it. If it's something that takes users time to learn, or that has a long-term loyalty thing, they can't measure it. And so all of that is underinvested in. So back to the news, what that might mean is that suppose, covering Syria, like people don't click on it because they look at it like, oh, I don't want to think about that. Is my whole continent going to blow up? I just don't want to look at it. But if you see that your newspaper is covering Syria, you sort of feel like this is a serious newspaper, and then when I am in the mood to read about it, I'm going to go back there. That type of long-term investment in quality and in relationship and in your brand is undermeasured. So paradoxically, the more data-driven these firms get, they do a better job relative to just guessing but they really tilt towards the short term. And also, I think Facebook, their newsfeed algorithm. I know the people who work on the Facebook algorithm. It's getting better all the time, but the first many years of Facebook is just very, very short-term driven, and I'm sure you see that yourselves. If you post something on Facebook, right? If like 3 people like it right away, then it goes to the top of all your other friends' news feeds, and then you get a zillion likes. But if the first few people who see it don't like it, it's pushed to the bottom, and nobody ever reads it. All of this is it's data driven, and it's better than them guessing what to put up for you, but it's going to bias things in really special ways.
That's a question.
Hi, I had 2 questions on 2 different parts of your talk. One has to do with what you were talking about with traditional newspapers dying, and it makes my heart break. The idea that the New York Times may not be around for a long time. And I was wondering whether there was some way for them to get around that. Maybe a different type. Price discrimination, I understand, is hard if you can't identify your users, but I was wondering if there's any scope for the freemium type of models that you see in some news websites. That was the first question. The second has to do with the last topic that you covered, the idea that in social media tends to reinforce our views. I know a big deal is made of this in the press, but I wonder to what extent that just reflects the fact that we are moving our offline worlds into the online world. We all hang out with people that look like us and share our beliefs. And I was wondering whether there was some way I understand you can't get at that cleanly with your data because it's online and not offline, but maybe using some of your machine learning tree type models to look at heterogeneous effects, given that certain demographics are more likely to move their lives online.
Excellent question. So I'll start with the second one. So Matt Jinskow and Jesse Shapiro have done more work on the offline world and comparing online to offline, and their results showed that there wasn't too much of a filter bubble. But their online data was only domain level browsing, not article level browsing. Obviously, I think some of that is the case that people move their offline world online, but there's also the case that it's sort of easier to find people who are just like you, and it's also gotten cheaper to create content that's highly targeted. And so I think on the supply side, we've seen these media outlets that are really tailoring towards clickability. It's like BuzzFeed has grown incredibly fast. And I used to have I was even quoted in a BuzzFeed article, which was actually a really well-researched article. But, when they got started, they was all like these headlines like, what your breakfast says about your sex life, and, like what, these cat names, and it was just, crazy stuff, but people clicked on it, and so I would say this is what you will get if you maximize for clicks. What people will click on is what your breakfast says about your sex life. That's what people want, okay? And so the supply has more of a chance to adjust to that. And no matter how polarized your editors are, how liberal the New York Times editors are, how conservative the Fox editors are, they are still much more balanced than what people actually click on when it's left to sort of popular voting. So I think that's what makes me a little more pessimistic. Then your first question, gosh, I have been to so many media conferences where they've said, oh, you're an award-winning economist. Tell us how to save the news business. And like, if only I could, Rupert Murdoch thought it was all about paywalls, but that works for Wall Street Journal. Yes, the paywall, I think people are figuring out how to make the paywalls work. The big problem is that you need these referral traffic. You need the traffic from search. You need it from Google News. So if you make your paywall too high, you're not going to get that. Also, our theory says the smaller you are, the less attractive you are to advertisers. Something that's really true in reality that wasn't in our model is also fixed costs. Like the advertisers have to take time to evaluate your audience, and they need data to evaluate your audience. Like the sample size is too small, they can't tell if their ads work. So if you're small, you're just kind of, at the bottom of the advertising market, you're just undifferentiated remnant inventory on Google DoubleClick Ad Exchange, and you don't make any money. So small works if you're really got a good audience, like a finance audience or something, but small is not so good otherwise. And so paywalls make you smaller, and that's bad. So I think, ultimately it's sort of consolidation is going to be one answer. Also, to the extent that they can cut out some of their fixed costs using shared technology platform. So you can either merge, or maybe you can use a shared technology platform but have different media brands. Or maybe a startup provides a one-size-fits-all digital platform so that the newspaper doesn't have any investment in the digital platform. They just produce the content, and so they can just kind of rent the intellectual property. But actually, like, running a website well and learning about your users and selling your ads is all expensive, and you just haven't got the money to cover the fixed costs, which is depressing.
Having said that, ironically, there have been a lot of M&A deals in online media recently, right? So, I mean, Springer bought Business Insider for what most people thought was an incredibly high valuation. FT, Economist, all those went pretty well. Jeff Bezos buying the Wall Street Journal, more as a hobby, I guess, but still. But then again, you get Vice Media, which I think had a 2 billion valuation. Last valuation was a 2 billion. Vox Media. So you have a couple of really profit-driven, venture capital-backed online media outlets that do very well and rise to extremely high valuations just because they're seen as a potential lead generation machine. So I think that if you build up OneFootball, for example, is a Berlin-based app. Who get extreme investor attention just because they're seen as a very focused lead generation channel for football clothing, tickets, all these kind of things. So I think that if you, through high quality content, build up a massive reach that you can use for lead generation, at least venture capital funds at the moment see that there's potential for you to monetize on high quality media as well. So, I mean,
that's right. Although still the scale economies are really hard because you have to figure out, like, well, if you're niche, like, how many ads are you going to sell? So, like, a friend of mine started Mint.com, which was a website where you provided all your financial information, and they had a few million viewers. But they could not cover their costs based on advertising, even though it was targeted finance website, just because they weren't big enough. So I think that the themes here that you need to have a great audience or be differentiated, or you need to be really big somehow. Otherwise, the costs and you have to sell a lot of ads to cover your costs.
Yeah, I agree. You need massive scale or ultra high specialization with a very high CLV of your.
Exactly. But I think that, the consolidation, in some sense, it could be good if you get, being big helps you be better, but it also could be concerning for viewpoints. And I think that we're just going to be stuck with a lot of consolidation. Now, it's interesting, we were talking in my office as well, I'm on the board of Expedia now, the travel conglomerate, and they actually have a lot of different brands, and they've kept all their brands. So they buy companies that compete with each other and don't merge them. They actually operate them as distinct brands, which is kind of crazy from an IO perspective, because you think, well, what's the, IO economists think the only reason people merge is to decrease competition, and here's this company buying brands and making them compete with each other. But that's, again, that's possibly, we'll see that in news, that you might see consolidated ownership, but still diverse political viewpoints. But that remains to be seen.
Somewhere in the back, I believe.
Thanks for the talk again. And I would like to ask if you see a role for behavioral economics or behavioral decision making in general in this kind of research, and then how can one start to bring knowledge from more behavioral domains in the type of work that you're doing?
Great, thanks so much. And so, in some sense, this was one reason I was really excited to give this talk here, of course, it's a broader social science topic, but also because of the great strengths of behavioral economics here and the experimental community as well. And so, absolutely. So I showed you that moving something just a little bit down the page had massive effects on what people did. Why? It's incredibly robust. It's not just search, it's all the different websites. But why and how much of that is self-reinforcing, like the fact that, people are trained to go top down, and they are trained to believe, Google trains them that the thing on top is a lot better than the thing in the third position, and so they carry that insight over to other websites. And I think, you see a lot of this habit formation. One thing that was hard for Bing, being small, is that you can't actually reset people's habits from Google. Also, there can be free riding. So Yahoo puts up a whole bunch of ads, and they're presumably free riding on the fact that Google has high quality ads, and Yahoo put up lower quality ads. I've measured this. It's not a subjective opinion, that's a fact. They put up lower quality ads, and people still click on them because they use Google more than they use Yahoo. So there's all sorts of interesting things about just how consumers behave, and that doesn't even get to the why, the real kind of underlying opinions. And then I think, Facebook is just so interesting. Of course, in some sense, my last paper does look more like a psychology or sociology paper or something. I'm asking about emotional content and perspective, and why do people post on Facebook? Why am I talking about my kindergartners barfing on Facebook, and 100 people like it? It's like my most popular Facebook post is my kindergarten throwing up. It's so interesting, what makes people do this. And then if you think that those same kind of psychological forces of wanting to fit in, wanting to have things in common, is also then driving news consumption, and it can feed back on our democracy. That people wanting to be liked on Facebook determines how people vote. That's kind of deep and profound, and we'll have a lot of different disciplines contribute to that. Did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, the board you just joined, Expedia, it has a lot. That's one website, Expedia and Booking and all the country companies, some of which I know quite well. That's behavioral economics in action for you, right? You can basically buy Thaler, Sunstein, Nudge, go through all the things. They work online, right? Default setting, how much do people tip online in our delivery services or any delivery service, It does make a difference what you set the default at. You tell them, the average price for a room on Airbnb in a certain city is X euros. They'll respond to that, right? 90% of people buy this or that, or you've got 18 people showed an interest in this or that. It all works. If you go through EasyJet, Ryanair, JetBlue, whatever their conversion funnels, the drip pricing they use, all of that works. So basically, in all types of behavioral pricing, default setting, all this entire behavioral economics toolbox, all of that is used by companies online, by big websites such as Booking and Expedia, and it all functions as it does in the lab.
So one of the place where it really kicks in is privacy. So, and this is something I've done a lot of industry work on, only a little bit of publishing on. But for years, Microsoft was trying to differentiate itself by privacy, and they were really better than Google on privacy, and nobody cared. And then you thought, well, maybe once people learn about it, so once you have these, it comes out that the NSA and the CIA are all spying on you and maintaining this huge data warehouses, maybe then people will care. And they talked about it, but they did very little. It's some of these interesting topics where people feel something, but they won't actually take action on it. Now, one of my former students, Catherine Tucker, did some work actually after the Edward Snowden revelations, and she did show that people changed what they searched for. So they stopped searching. They wouldn't type terrorist things into Google because they realized somebody was spying on them. But generally, in terms of not using Google, no, we're not going to go that far, guys. I like my Gmail. So people's behavior is almost lexicographic. They choose the product first, and these other things come later, even though they say they're important. But also, it's very hard to know when that will change, right? Because so Snowden came. I thought maybe people would start changing their behavior, but democracy. So I thought that was an interesting test case. But still, you could imagine something happening that would cause people to change their behavior.
Yes, one last question.
Hello, thank you again very much. So you've touched on this a couple times in terms of the fact that the result of your last paper might lead to a decrease in supply of neutral news, essentially. So if I'm a policymaker and I believe that there's some public good in having people consume neutral news, what do? Do I increase funding for PBS? Do I regulate these social media sites?
Well, so in the United States, I think increased public funding for PBS is, very, 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 very unlikely to happen. So I guess you got to rely on the Brits to fund BBC. Yeah, I think, in the end, actually, news is a public good. And, Europe seems to get that. America doesn't. But in the end, it has some very unique properties. It's an information good that's hard to copy. That's easy to copy. And so, this has gone back over 100 years when they invented the telegraph. People, the West Coast newspapers would copy the East Coast news, and they would telegraph the stories over. And there was debate about that at the time, and ultimately freedom of speech won out. And they said, we just cannot stop the newspapers from copying. We just can't. And preserve freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So, this is something where you do research and development, and it used to be you have to pay a telegraph, and now you can just copy it, and millions of people can copy it. So, in some sense, it's kind of shocking that we get as much investment as we do when you think about how hard it is to appropriate the returns on your research and development. So, yeah, absolutely, you should expect a market failure. And we are not willing to patent news. So what do? Subsidize.
And outside we will have subsidized, fully free drinks and pretzels. Susan, thank you so very much for the talk and the discussion now. And please do all join us if you have more questions. You can approach Susan. We will be here for at least half an hour. Have a drink. Thank you again.